Okay, good evening. Welcome. My name is Chris Otten. I want to just first thank TENAC for inviting me to moderate tonight's DC Attorney General candidate debate and forum. I'm a 22-year DC resident, a former ANC commissioner. I ran for mayor in 2006 with the state of Greens. I hosted one of the first AG candidate debates in 2014, and I'm co-facilitator with DC for Reasonable Development, and now a steering committee member with the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition, which is a citywide organization focused on finding solutions and policies to fight displacement in DC, which is why I think TENAC invited me. And I am joined, I want to thank TENAC for doing this because we are joined tonight by three amazing candidates. DC folks are very lucky to have three amazing candidates running for AG. Now, I want to put this information in the chat box so that everybody can link through to our three candidates who I've listed here in alphabetical order. One of these folks is going to replace the very popular first elected Attorney General for DC, Carl Racine. Big shoes to fill. And so tonight we're going to go through a lot of topics and move quickly. I believe we have a timer, and we're going to try to be strict about that. I ask candidates to kind of stick to the timing of this. And we're going to start with introductions and basically give each candidate 45 seconds to open up, and then we'll go into questions. A lot of the questions I ask are going to be either up, down, yes, no, yes, thumbs up, no, thumbs down, and or 2-minute sort of exposition, if you will. And so let's turn it over. I'm going to start with the alphabetical order, starting with Mr. Jones, Esquire. Why don't you open up tonight and start with your introduction? 45 seconds, please.
Mr. Otten, TENAC DC, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share my platform with you, as I am running for Attorney General in my hometown in order to make a difference, cure disparities that have existed far too long, especially in the housing area. As Attorney General, I will use every resource possible to fight on your behalf and bring justice in every area that we see fit. I appreciate your time and look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. Mr. Schwalb.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me. I'm Brian Schwalb. I'm a third-generation Washingtonian, father of 3 daughters. I came back to Washington to join the Justice Department in the Clinton administration. I've been practicing law here in the District of Columbia for nearly 30 years. I am running for Attorney General because I want to make sure the law is working for everybody who lives in the District of Columbia, and that we put the law to work on what I think is the greatest challenge we have for a city abundant in resource, abundant in financial and human talent, but a city that doesn't share those resources and opportunity fairly. I think the law is the single most powerful tool we have to do that. I'm proud to be endorsed by our current Attorney General, Carl Racine, and I'm looking forward to talking with you this evening about the issues that are a forefront mind for TENAC and the listeners.
Thank you. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Bruce Spiva, and for nearly 30 years, the District of Columbia has been my home. My wife, Anna, and I have raised our 2 sons here. I love the city, and I want to continue to fight to make it better, especially for those who've been left out and left behind. I've never forgotten that I stand on the shoulders of others, most prominently my mother and my late father, who both grew up in the Jim Crow era South, and both of whom went on to lives of service to others. My father graduated from an HBCU in 1954, the year the Brown decision came down. And he believed in the power of the law to change our lives for the better. He inspired me to pursue a career in the law, and he instilled in me the sense of duty and courage to fight for change. And that's what I've spent the last nearly 30 years doing, fighting for everyday people, fighting for civil rights and consumer protection and voting rights. I'm running for Attorney General because I want to be your lawyer. I'm ready and prepared to stand up to the powerful, whether it's unscrupulous corporations, slumlords, polluters, or the government itself. I'm ready to take on these fights because in my 30 years of legal practice, I've taken them on before and won. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Like I said, this is not hyperbole. 3 amazing candidates here. We're very familiar with DC courts, the court system, and beyond. So let's get right into it. Now, you all probably saw kind of what we're going to cover tonight. There's going to be a lot of topics we're going to try to cover in a very short amount of time. So let's start with that. I think you saw that in the email. I hope you did. So let's go with policies to protect our unhoused communities. Over the past 2 years, during a global pandemic, Mayor Bowser has sent in bulldozers to tear down unhoused DC residents' tents and living areas around the city, including, and I was there, bulldozing a tent with a person still inside of it. Thumbs up or down on the camera. Would you seek injunctions as AG against the mayor's agencies who seek to displace these already displaced communities around DC? Yes or no? Mr. Jones, that's a thumbs up. Mr. Schwalb?
Can't answer it yes or no, Chris. It's going to depend on the facts and circumstances.
Mr. Spiva?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not a yes or no, but I'm generally against the forced removal of homeless encampments.
Okay, 2 minutes each. So let's go into this a little bit. What is your legal take on encampments generally across the city? And as AG, what could you do to prevent such a violent way of disrupting unhoused DC communities and ensure there are protective measures in place before bulldozers are even allowed on site? Let's start with Mr. Jones.
Thank you. What the city needs to do is increase its outreach and provide unhoused residents with the resources that it says it has. I'm operating with information that I only see from the outside. My understanding is that there are resources for the unhoused. There are places that unhoused can go. Now, and as Attorney General, I would want to make sure that every unhoused person is getting the outreach and the information necessary to be housed. I also look to some new creative ideas that are being put forth by other candidates who are running and people who are currently sitting who want to make use of unused spaces to house individuals that are currently unhoused. And I would absolutely support that and make sure that I would use my legal acumen to make sure that we put the policies, laws, and regulations in place to have that be reality. As far as what's currently happening with the unhoused, I think we have to use humane measures in order to get this outreach to the people that need it the most. There's no simple solution or one answer that we can describe in 2 minutes or so that would make anyone feel positive, but know that I care about this issue greatly. Know that there are ways that we can affect people who are in these conditions, and that's not just getting housing, but getting jobs, getting people the mental resources and things that they need to get back on their feet, getting them other resources that they may need, substance abuse issues, whatever it is that has put them in those predicaments in the first place, and get them resolved so that they aren't revisiting these unhoused conditions. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Okay, so 2 minutes, Mr. Schwalb.
Thank you. So look, it hurts my heart. I think it hurts all of our hearts when we see our fellow human beings and DC residents living outside, whether it's in the bitter cold of the winter time or very hot summers that we have here. It's a basic human right, I believe, to have housing and for people to be in stable housing. We don't ask the question enough, why? I think the question why is the most important question that we can ask when we're confronting the fact that too many people are experiencing homelessness, but we know that the reasons why people are experiencing homelessness are different. There are some folks, moms and young kids, who are experiencing family homelessness for reasons of domestic violence, or mom's lost her job and she's suffering an economic setback and can't afford the rent. And I think the city's done a pretty good job of addressing family homelessness. We've got young kids, oftentimes LGBTQ kids, who are abandoned by their families or confronting discrimination or abandonment, and they're living on the street for a different kind of reason. We've got people who are living in deplorable conditions in their homes, and it's safer for them to be living outside than in the deplorable conditions, particularly during the pandemic when there was overcrowding. And then, of course, there are many people who are struggling with mental health challenges, substance abuse challenges, which has caused them to be living on the street. And I think as an attorney general and as everybody who's elected to office, we owe it to ask the question why, because how we address responses and solutions turns on those root causes of why people are unhoused. I think it is inhumane to bulldoze people under any circumstances. I think forced destruction of encampments is not the way to address the need for making sure people have stable housing. Whether there's a basis for an injunction or a legal action from the Attorney General does depend on the facts and circumstances. But no, as your Attorney General, I'm going to be asking the question why, and asking our agencies and our government to be accountable to addressing those root causes.
Thank you. Same question to you, Mr. Spiva. Again, with what could you do as AG to prevent such a violent way of disrupting our unhoused communities?
Well, I think it's incumbent on the Attorney General to counsel, advise, and even pressure the agencies, the executive agencies, not to take inhumane and unconstitutional or actions that violate people's rights. And so I certainly wouldn't be shy about doing that. I'm against violent removal of people from encampments. I think the solution to homelessness ultimately is housing. And so I would advocate for, I say at the outset, it's not like I would have a budget to provide, but I certainly have a voice, and I would advocate for providing housing to individuals who are living in homeless encampments to try to get them off the streets. That's better for everybody. I would certainly fight to try to provide more affordable housing by fighting slumlords who deliberately push people out of their buildings and holding developers to their promises when they get city money in exchange for creating affordable housing. You also have to meet people where they are. There are many individuals who are suffering from mental illness or substance abuse challenges. And so we need to provide the types of services, the mental health counseling and the substance abuse counseling, to help them be able to accept and take advantage of resources that are offered to them. So that would be my response: is we need to meet people where they are, and we need to provide the resources for them to be housed ultimately. And that I am against the forced removal of people in a violent way.
Well, as three candidates schooled in the art of language, the term affordable is something that's quite squishy in this city, as you know. So I want to get into that now. Racial equity in DC, AKA Chocolate City. The US Census shows over 60,000 Black folks have been displaced from DC in the past 20 years. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Should housing security for Black communities in Washington, D.C. be a priority for the AG office? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Gentlemen.
You want us all to do it at once? Yeah.
Sure.
Yes, thumbs up.
Okay, that's okay, cool. And then 2 minutes each, we'll go through this and we'll reverse the order starting with Mr. Spiva first. Why is the city, why are we as a city failing so direly to help Black families thrive and remain here? What legal tools can you expect as AG to fight displacement of DC's communities of color, particularly vulnerable communities around a lot of the development, and ensure racial equity policies and programs are truly effective here in DC? 2 minutes each, starting with Mr. Spiva.
Yeah, well, I mean, this could be a much longer answer if one traced the history, going back to redlining. My parents, when they went to buy their first house in 1959, were told by their bank that they weren't financing houses for Blacks in that neighborhood at that time. And so we've had government-sponsored redlining of housing. And so the roots of the inequities are very deep. So I believe that we need to do everything we can to try to promote equity for all people, those who are disproportionately impacted by the income inequality that we see in our city and other cities see as well, is Black and brown folks. But we need to do things for all low income people, and that will help staunch the displacement. So going back to what I was saying before, we need to fight slumlords that deliberately push people out of their property in order to make way for high-end housing. We need to hold developers to their promises. We need to look at programs to help longtime residents who were here during the bad times, but may not be able to afford the taxes. If they're a homeowner, they may not be able to afford the taxes on their property any longer. And we need to look at ways of making accommodations for that. None of these solutions reside entirely within the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General can do a lot along the lines that I just mentioned, but it's going to take working together with other agencies, including agencies under the mayor. And so I would seek to work collaboratively on these solutions, and I would seek to take down the temperature between the AG's office and the mayor's office to get solutions that work for the whole city.
Thank you for that. We touched on a lot of points there. Mr. Schwalb, again, focusing on what legal tools as AG that will help fight displacement in DC.
Well, in talking with voters and residents across the city, I hear so often the statement being made that people have lived through the poverty and they're entitled to stay for the prosperity. And they're right. There are too many folks who for generations have owned property or lived in affordable places in the District of Columbia, and with the ever increasing prices for housing in our city and increasing real estate values, they've been priced out and pushed out. And the law does have some very concrete role to play in stemming displacement. I'll give you a couple of examples. We need to aggressively enforce our housing laws and our housing code to make sure that landlords are complying with the housing law. Too many times we have owners of real estate that are engaged in a pernicious practice of constructive eviction, where they recognize that the cost and the time associated with going through a legal eviction process is too time consuming. And so they engage in forcing people out by making the conditions deplorable. An AG can and should bring actions, and under my leadership, the office will continue to bring actions against slumlords who engage in the practice of constructive eviction. We need to make sure that when developers are engaging in the development needed, and we do need to develop additional houses and housing units in our city because we have a high demand for housing and not enough supply, that's always going to put upward pressure on prices. We need to make sure that developers are committing to plans that will be enforceable so that tenants are not displaced during construction, that if they have to be moved temporarily, they have a contractual right to come back, and not just come back to their communities, but at the same prices and at the same cost as what they're living under at the time being. We need to make sure that when we're thinking about development and growth, we're thinking about downstream economic impact. And of course, there's a consumer protection element that I hope I'll get a chance to talk about, where too many longtime property owners are being scammed out of their homes and the equity they own in their homes from scam artists and telemarketing. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that, Chris, later in the discussion.
Indeed. Okay, Mr. Jones, 2 minutes on this question of displacement and racial equity and what you can do as AG to stem the tide of Black families being displaced from our city.
Yeah, I'll carry the baton from Mr. Schwab mentioning scam artists and those folks who've been approached in this city over the last 20 years with vouchers, underpricing folks out of their homes and then having them redeveloped and then pushing out their neighbors because the taxes have risen on their properties due to the increased value of another, and forced other neighbors out of their homes based on the taxes in order to allow them to keep up with the rising costs of living in Washington, D.C. I believe that you have to revise the tax code in such a way that it's dynamic to allow historic residents to stay, to allow them to enjoy not only the equity that they are getting in their homes, but to ensure that they won't be pushed out because of a neighbor coming in and raising the cost of living or raising the average price of a home in a certain neighborhood, which creates the increase of property taxes. So we've identified, for the most part, what it is that has displaced African Americans and brown people in this city. I believe as AG, those are the ways I would fight on behalf of district residents by trying to make the revisions to the tax code that ensures that historic residents can stay, but then also looking to creating an analogous housing commission to one of the Securities and Exchange Commission and that would be advice to the mayor and council to create a housing commission because we're in a city that is growing in prosperity, and housing is a way that people are transferring wealth and making so much money, and to the detriment of others. And we need to make sure that housing being transferred is done in a fair and equitable way and protecting people on both sides of the equation of a transfer. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Jones, for that. As a moderator privilege, Mr. Schwab, you talked about housing supply and demand. How do your comments around that match the realities of the significant, substantial number, and it's conservative, of vacant units in DC right now? At least 15,000 plus vacant units conservatively. According to AYOBA, the building association, they are citing 30% vacant units in Navy Yard and up Wisconsin Avenue. When you talk about housing supply and demand, and elaborate how that squares up with how many vacant units there are in the city.
Well, we have units that may be unoccupied, but are either too expensive for the people who need them to be able to live in them. We have as the Washington Post reported recently, we've got about 3,000 units that are vacant and unoccupied, but are in buildings that the owners are intentionally keeping vacant or not keeping up. And so we have to attack the problem of supply of housing with all of the ways in which we can under the law. You take, for example, the houses that are abandoned or in blighted properties. We have a tax code that allows an increased higher tax to be imposed on vacant houses and then an even higher tax on blighted property. The government is not working as well as it should in terms of imposing those taxes, collecting those taxes, holding the owners of those properties accountable. There needs to be greater collaboration and enforcement. That taxing responsibility falls in DCRA as well as in our Office of Tax and Revenue. And I think an attorney general that's thinking proactively about advising and working with agencies can make sure those laws are being better enforced. Okay. We have the reality that oftentimes people are scamming the city. They're absentee owners and they're putting in a building permit application to DCRA to delay or avoid those excessive taxes by making it seem as if they're actually going to fix the properties up. Very recently, Carl Racine's office brought a lawsuit, not only under the tax code, but under the False Claims Act, for holding owners accountable for making misrepresentations to the government about their plans to fix buildings to avoid the taxes. Those are just two examples of the way in which our government can work in a more aggressive, coordinated, efficient way to make sure the laws that we have on our books are efficiently enforced, hopefully to free up some of that housing. But we still have to recognize that there are too many people who can't afford to live in the housing, and we need more affordable housing to be built and be made available for people who want to live here. It also includes workforce housing, not necessarily affordable. And as you said, the term affordable is squishy. We should talk about what we mean when we're talking about affordable, but we have to continue to expand the number of units in supply too.
And for the listening audience, if you want to see the stats that I'm citing too, it's the census numbers and vacancy numbers. You can go to dcnumber4reality.org/updates, and it's in the first post right there. I want to move to the next set of questions, which is about the independence of the AG office. In late 2021, Carr Racine said, quote, "I think the development arm of this city has acted intentionally and with great purpose. And we see the result. The highest level of displacement of anywhere else in the United States of America. Now, the Office of Attorney General is free at last to act independently, and that's what we're going to do." He said that on the Kojo Namdi show, December 17th, 2021. 2 minutes each. As a candidate to take the helm of DC's lead attorney, what does Mr. Racine's statement mean to you, and why is it important to voters? And let's start this time with Mr. Schwalb.
Well, the reason why that statement is so important for all of us who live in the District of Columbia is that our statute was amended. The people voted, our council passed the statute that changed fundamentally the nature of this office. The Office of Attorney General is no longer appointed by the mayor. It is now an independently elected office in which the Attorney General is selected by the voters of our city. That's of critical importance to us as a city striving for statehood, striving for more meaningful say over our affairs, a meaningful expansion of home rule in terms of decision-making that the voters and the residents have. It plays itself out in a lot of important ways every day, because what it means is an independent Attorney General is there to fight for the public interest, to fight to hold government accountable, to make sure that all of the branches of the government are doing their job. Because fundamentally, all of us who live here in DC and pay taxes in DC deserve a government that works. And having an AG that's independent, that can hold agencies accountable, can hold the mayor accountable, is of critical importance. But we also have to remember something, that our statute that creates the Attorney General's office also requires the Attorney General to be the chief law officer of the city, to defend the agencies, to give advice and counsel to the agencies and the mayor and the city council, and to protect the public interest, and of course, to be the chief prosecutor of our juvenile justice criminal system. It's a job of immense difficulty and inherent conflict. And so being independent in the setting that AG Racine was talking about was in terms of being independent during the planning and land use process, the entitlement process, and having an Attorney General playing an active role in certain development and zoning decisions. I thought that was a very important development and expansion of where the Attorney General can step up and fight for communities and people and residents when sometimes their interests are in conflict with other parts of the government. But it's a hard job because those interests of the government also have to be advanced and protected too.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Spiva, to the same quote from Mr. Racine, as an independent agency that he's free at last. What does that statement mean to you, and why is it important to voters?
I think in the specific context that he was using it, he was talking about the ability now, rather than representing the zoning agencies in the city, that the office would now represent the interests of in the public, and would take positions on certain land uses in order to increase or preserve affordable housing, and for instance, in density decisions. And I think that's a salutary, a good development, and something that I would seek to build upon. I think the independence of the office more generally, which is something that I supported from the beginning. We actually had to have litigation over the independence of the office and the elected office back in 2014 when it was first formed, because Irv Nathan, the unelected Attorney General at that time, together with certain council members, sought to put off the election unlawfully. Luckily, the courts kept it in place, and it went forward. And so I think it's very important that the Attorney General is elected by the people and has the people's interests at heart, whether that's in affirmative litigation of the type that I've done lots of, pursuing slumlords who deliberately try to drive their tenants out. I fought for Black, Latino, and Asian residents of Columbia Heights who were pushed out by both the slumlords and the District of Columbia itself, and was able to recover money damages for those people for the trauma they had been put through. But also, even in your defensive role, I think that paramount must be the interests of the people. And so that means where the district is going wrong, you have an obligation to counsel them, even to pressure them to make it right. And that's what I'll do as Attorney General.
Thank you for that. By the way, shout out to Paul Zuckerberg, Esquire, who challenged that in 2014 to win the election of our first Attorney General in that year that it was passed. Mr. Jones, to this important question, the independence of AG, what was Mr. Racine saying when he was talking about the development arm and the displacement of the city, and now he is able to act independently? What does that mean to you, and why is that important to voters?
We've heard from my colleagues, and they've identified the strength of the office. Having independence allows the Attorney General to basically play as a defender to the district. It can also act as an advocate for its residents. Having that independence allows us to choose which side the district needs to be on in order to protect the district as a whole. And you're giving yourself and the district the cost-benefit analysis, the legal analysis required to have a long view. What is the greatest impact to its residents in the district with the certain legal decision that we make? The independence of the office needs to be ramped up and robust. And we can do that by taking on cases that then win us judgments that allow the office to stand on its own and viciously pursue certain cases that maybe if it weren't independent, it could not. What does that mean? Because it's an independent office, you're gonna have a budget. You're not gonna have to trade and compromise with other agencies or other branches of the government in order to get money to operate. If you're winning cases that then allow you to take a strong stance against maybe those other agencies or those other branches of government, so that it can have that robust independence. So it is essential that the Office of Attorney General not only become a strong advocate for the district residents, regardless of the matter, especially against developers who may not be upholding the promises to the district and providing affordable homes to its residents as it promised when it was entering into those deals with the district. But it also means that the agency or the Office of Attorney General can be an advocate on behalf of the district and defend the district against anybody making claims that they didn't operate in the best interest of the residents, depending upon whatever the facts may be.
Appreciate that, Mr. Jones. Thank you for that. Interestingly enough, despite Mr. Racine's statements, he is now still representing the mayor on a key challenge across the city, specifically the lawsuit against the recent DC Comprehensive Plan amendments. The DC Comprehensive Plan is DC central planning document, and the mayor has wanted to change the planning maps and 1,000 pages of changes and increase the zoning, the density of the city across 200 million square feet of land. This is not a small endeavor. And DC residents from across the city filed claims that fundamental legal and basic planning requirements were not followed regarding those changes. And the laws ask the mayor to ensure progress reports, impact studies are done, and things like on the environment, impacts on the environment, on existing public services, transportation, is it going to overcrowd schools if we induce all this population? What kind of impact studies were done? So Mr. Racine is still representing the mayor on that right now. I'm wondering for the folks who are in that lawsuit and for the city in general, if elected, would you ensure city planners must conduct neighborhood level progress reports, impact studies on proposed land use changes before implementing those land use changes? Just as a yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down. Would you ensure impact studies are done? Thumbs up, thumbs down, just for the audience here.
I can't answer that one yes or no. Sorry, that's not a yes or no question.
And especially given that the issues are in pending litigation right now, Chris, it wouldn't be appropriate, I don't think, for a candidate to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on that.
Well,
Chris,
yes,
the way I understood the question was that would you require a city impact statement? That's the only thing I'm giving you a thumbs up for. And I think that's the question.
That makes sense. Yeah, basically, if elected, given Mr. Racine's statement about independence, would you disengage the OAG from representing the mayor on the comp plan lawsuit? Yes or no? Thumbs up, thumbs down.
I'm happy to explain my rationale, but I'm not going to give.
Go ahead, Mr. Spiva. Go ahead, explain it.
I think we to be very clear, when I say that the office is independent and that it should always keep the public interest paramount, that doesn't mean that you can just willy-nilly decide that you're not going to defend a lawsuit against the government. You have a general obligation to defend the government. But what I'm saying is that you have a duty to counsel your client and even push your client to comply with the law. And that's exactly what I would do. There may be some rare instances where the conduct is so egregious and where you can't get your client to comply, and you may be prohibited by ethical restrictions from speaking out publicly, potentially, where you might walk away from the representation as a last resort. But it's truly a last resort because there's a cost to that. If you do that, you then lose your seat at the table and the leverage that you have to try to get the government to make it right. So that's why I can't say yes or no to this. I would need to evaluate what the law actually requires. I think it's a good idea. And I certainly would be someone at the table, I think, pushing for it. But whether I would take the drastic step of saying I'm not going to even defend that's something that I couldn't say at the present moment.
That's understandable. But to your points, it really, there's this blurred line about who is your client. Is your client the mayor who has chosen to, according to these plaintiffs, ignore the law? Or is it the DC residents who are saying the mayor chose to ignore this law, which requires environmental impact studies? That's where there's this kind of ambiguity that seems to be arising here with the AG office and what Mr. Racine said on Kojo's show, and what's actually happening. Mr. Jones, do you have any comments on that?
What you've identified is what I believe makes us this race so important. You have to have a legal mind that steps in and recognizes both sides. There's a balancing of harms that you have to do. And I think the counseling that anyone decides to give to the mayor, the council, and where it decides to step in on behalf of the residents, it's going to be based on cost benefit analysis, what the facts are, what the legal ramifications will be, not just for the present moment, but for years to come? What do you open up the district government to dealing with if you have to have someone else step in on behalf of the district or on behalf of residents? What do you open up the district to down the road? And so it's going to make it a critical decision on how you decide to advise on the government side or on the behalf of residents. So it's a case-by-case analysis. It's something that every attorney will have to do, not only in this role, but whenever they're interfacing with clients.
That makes sense. And in this case, we're talking about DC's central planning document and how the city will develop. It's also what the zoning commission relies on when they're approving the projects that, by the way, simultaneously has led to a lot of this displacement, which we went over earlier. Mr. Schwalb, do you have any comments again, just in terms of who your client would be necessarily, and in the context of such a major policy decisions related to comprehensive planning in the city?
Yeah, I I think that the mayor and the agencies need to follow the law. That's a given. And I don't want to dwell too much, Chris, on the specifics of the lawsuit that's pending for the reasons I've stated already. It is a pending lawsuit, and if I'm fortunate enough to be elected, it'll be a lawsuit that my office will have to deal with. So let's step up a little bit more broadly to the question you're asking, which focuses not only on the inherent difficulty of being Attorney General in the District of Columbia, balancing the need to defend and represent the agencies in the city, while also defending and protecting the public interest, fighting for the people who live in the city to make sure that they're protected, while at the same time protecting taxpayer dollars that are often at issue with respect to how the AG's office defends lawsuits. The key to all of that, in my view, is judgment. I think that the key to electing an attorney general who can do this job, that has an inherent conflict of interest almost every day you come to work, is hiring somebody who has spent the years practicing law in lots of different difficult settings where there are difficult, complex issues, and having to use the law to solve problems. For the last 30 years, that's what I've been doing. I'm the only candidate in this case that was actually a government lawyer who stood up for the United States of America and said, I represent the United States in a particular matter, namely enforcing the laws. That's what the District of Columbia Attorney General attorneys have to do, is to step up and decide how do they defend the District of Columbia. There are times when your client is right and has been wrongly accused of something, and you have to vigorously defend. That's what the taxpayers expect. And there are times when a client hasn't done right, and those cases need to be resolved. You're raising the issue with respect to zoning and land use. It's no different than when the District of Columbia's MPD is sued and a particular police officer is being accused of violating the law. When the cases are not well founded in law and fact, the lawyers have to defend them. When they are well founded in fact, and there's been a violation of the law, maybe the cases need to get settled, and the attorney general lawyers got to make sure the agencies do better the next time around.
I really appreciate that feedback from all three of you. Let's continue on this theme in terms of access to the AG's office for the people of the District of Columbia. As a thumbs up, thumbs down, would you, as AG, offer up ward level resource centers? So in other words, a kind of a ward level AG office, if you will, that would house, let's say, computer legal research terminals and attorneys for people to consult with. For public use, the terminals for public use, like access to Westlaw, things that we don't normally have access to right now as everyday people going to the zoning commission and beyond. Would you consider offering up ward level resources that way? Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yes, I would consider those types of resources. The particulars would have to be worked out, but,
Sure.
but I'm giving thumbs up to yes, that I would consider it and would do something like that.
Yeah, Chris, I've been talking throughout this campaign that the community engagement role that the AG plays is critical, and being in the community, physically in the community with AG lawyers is critical. I agree with Mr. Spiva. What that exactly looks like and the costs associated, the capital necessary is all subject to having to be worked out.
Sure. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, I look at the cost considerations and what's available and how we can empower other maybe nonprofit groups to step in and provide those types of resources to residents and A and C commissioners who are up against developers oftentimes and go into community meetings and they don't have those resources. And again, you have to be aware of whatever conflicts of interest may come down the road. So you wouldn't necessarily want an AG office attorney in these satellite offices who are then providing legal counsel on one end and then may be forced to be on the other end down the road. So we have to probably look at having nonprofits step into that space or outside counsel of another nature in order to get those types of comprehensive legal tools to our residents, just because of what's potentially possible in the conflict of interest.
I appreciate that elucidation. That makes a lot of sense. 2 minutes each. If communities are requesting help with the AG office, so residents, how do you ensure a duty of care to respond to those voices in a reasonable time and way so that everyday citizens can seek remedy, let's say, against big businesses with high-powered lawyers or consumer rights protection issues? How do you foresee helping everyday residents who call the AG's office and say, I'm having this problem? Let's start with Mr. Schwalb.
So as somebody who's been practicing law for a long time, somebody calls and needs help, the answer is never, I don't do that, go away. Any decent lawyer says, I may not be the expert in that, but let me figure out how we can help. And that's what the Attorney General's office has to do, and it has to have a ethos in the office that it's there to help. I believe a community engagement commitment from our Attorney General is critical. And what that looks like is being out in the communities, talking with people who live in the communities about what they're confronting. Sometimes that's pushing information out to the community. What kind of trends in the law are happening? What are the fundamental rights that are available to people? When there are particular scams or things happening that we're seeing where people are potentially being taken advantage of, it's much better to let the community know about these things in advance so people can protect themselves than having to deal with it after the fact and seek redress and remedies after people have been harmed. So that's critical for the Attorney General's office to be in community, pushing information out and educating. But it's also equally important for an AG to be listening and receiving information from the community, because it's oftentimes people living in the community, tenant groups, workers, people who are consumers, seniors who are seeing things in real time. They are the folks who can bring the facts, the witnesses, the documents to an Attorney General's office so that effective lawsuits can be brought, impact advocacy can be pursued, and the AG can be taking the law and using it to change behavior. We don't want to have to keep repeating the same types of lawsuits. We want to bring the right effective lawsuits and change behavior. That's critical to be in relationship with labor unions, and I'm very proud to have had the endorsements of several of the labor unions who want to engage directly with the Attorney General's office to bring cases. Sometimes cases will wend their way through agencies and come to the AG's office, but I want to make sure there are direct lines of communications to the AG. And the way that works is you hold everybody accountable in the AG's office to be responsive.
Right on. To you, Mr. Jones, same question.
We've been doing these debates for a while, and this is a great question. This is a great way to articulate how it is our office will function. As you want to use the OAG's office as potentially a referral type of atmosphere. If you get a call, you might not be the expert, or you may not have the resources to do it, so you'll be able to spin it out to other attorneys who do need the work. That creates an environment in Washington, D.C. for legal profession to continue to grow and take on tough issues. Obviously, you can come to the website, you may be able to use social media, maybe text, call, and have a form that guides residents on how to give us the facts, what witnesses are there, all the information necessary to build a case, to see if there's something actually there. And, you know, treat it like a consultation. And then from that point, go into an analysis. Go through and figure out if there's cases there. And when we are triaging this information, we may be able to see a wide swath of the complaints coming from a similar sort and a similar nature, and that we have potentially a class action on our hands, or a case of another sort of great impact that then can win the Office of Attorney General some funding to allow it to continue its independence without relying on other arms of the government and having to compromise. So I believe that would be a critical function of the office, and we have to ramp that portion up in order to sustain as an independent office. I look to doing that in all creative ways, as well as creating a fillable form. But obviously, this is a theory of growth that I believe will be critical to the success of the office moving forward, not just for right now in 2022 or 2023, but in years to come.
Right on. Okay, Mr. Spiva, same question to you.
Hey. Well, I think as a structural matter, the Office of Community Engagement used to be in the front office of the Attorney General's office. I understand it is not now. So I would look seriously at bringing it back into the front office to demonstrate and actually have it as a very prominent priority of mine. I want to be out there myself. I also want leadership and attorneys and other professionals to be out in the community. That may mean, as you mentioned a little while ago, actually even establishing a physical presence. It may mean also, or certainly would mean, having town halls and listening sessions of the sort that have been held in the past, both to listen to and to provide help to the residents. I want to work very actively with the legal services community so that when we have issues that need to be referred to them, we can send people and they have a place to go. Or if it's not something that we can take on directly. And I'm very proud that the former head of the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia has endorsed me, Eric Angel, and is on my team. I also, though, am the one in the race with the experience of actually taking on this kind of impact litigation myself. I formed my own law firm and maintained it for many years, fighting on the side of everyday people, representing classes of district residents, fighting against unscrupulous corporations, either who had committed some type of unlawful or fraudulent act or violated our competition laws. And so I know how to do this, and you don't have to wonder whether I'm going to follow through on what I'm saying. This is not something that came to me, when I started running for office. This is the type of thing that I've been doing for 30 years now. And so I'll be able to take it on and to win for the people. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. My bad.
No,
Thank you for that, Mr. Spiva. One of the calls you might get, when you're AG, is from somebody who's calling about adverse environmental impacts from, let's say, some of the shoddy construction activities that are particularly acutely harming communities of color, low-income families who are at the front lines of this new build developments across the city. Referencing like Southwest DC, 4 times as many environmentally related deaths than Northwest. Or think of Northeast, the burden of the industrial pollution there, the concentration of that. 2 minutes each. How do you see, and this, we're almost, I'm down to 2 questions and then a close. So I know we started late, but in terms of environmental protection, how do you see your OAG office intervening and helping lift up these environmental protection laws that seek to help DC residents who are being overwhelmed with more and more of these development projects across the city, but particularly on the front lines? Mr. Jones, so let's start with you right now.
Thank you. So our protection of the environment for individuals and residents goes to clean water, clean soil. We're talking about clean air and how that can affect the health of residents around and what it does to runoff to our neighbors, as well as the wildlife that it could potentially affect downstream, because we do have two rivers that are our city. I think it is essential that we are making sure that we live up to the standards, not only from federal legislation and regulation, but our own. So not only putting good laws on our books, but then it comes down to the enforcement. Being a good attorney isn't just recognizing the issues, but it's how you are to enforce the law. And I believe as it relates to our environmental issues, as you've identified, especially with clean air and water, and how these construction sites can affect our water supply, we have to make sure that before the problem happens, that every preventative measure is in place, that we recognize by the professionals and the experts in that space. That's protocol. Is the protocol in place that we've adopted as exceptional and as the standard? Are those in place to begin with? So we're not dealing with the harm on the back end and trying to recruit losses, which money can't actually compensate accurately for. So on the other side of that, we're talking about litigation. If companies come in and they're not disposing of waste properly, if they're not putting the right technologies in place to make sure that the pollution isn't affecting our air too harshly, we have to hold them accountable, and we will do that in our courts. And that's what I will do as Attorney General for the District.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Jones. Mr. Spiva, same question. Environmental protections, how to help DC residents, particularly around the front lines of the development areas of the city.
Yeah, it's such an important issue, and it is an issue of racial equity as well. We see rates of asthma that are much higher among our communities of color than they are in our majority communities. Certainly I stood in Brentwood with the residents there, where they have several industrial uses right in that small community in DC. I have fought for environmental justice in my career, so the theme is the same here. You don't have to wonder what I'm going to do. You can look at what I have been doing. I fought big oil and forced a big oil company to pay close to $50 million to improve clean air as a result of an antitrust lawsuit. And so this is something that I will give a lot of priority to. I'm concerned also, it's part, I've been fighting for statehood for decades. And of course we have still have a plant in DC that's run by the federal government that still burns some coal. And I'm very concerned about that. And I think that's an encroachment on our rights, and of course, very harmful to our environment. So I know how to go about attacking these issues, because they are very similar to the issues that I've been attacking for years through my practice in terms of fighting for consumer protection, fighting for antitrust enforcement, fighting for workers' rights. And that's the same kind of lens I'll bring to this. I'll also try to work in cooperation with neighboring jurisdictions and other jurisdictions around the country, because pollution doesn't observe borders. It doesn't stop at the border. A chemical spill doesn't stop at the border. And so we have mutual interests in trying to get this under control, and I'll try to work with them to try to do that. So those are some of the things that I would do to attack this very important priority.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Schwalb.
So the Attorney General plays a critical role in protecting our environment. Part of it is making sure our existing laws are enforced. That's the experience I bring to this as a trial attorney at the Justice Department, charged with bringing cases, building cases that enforce the law. I was enforcing tax laws. I was taking a regulatory structure, a legal structure in a tax situation, and enforcing the laws. Very similar to what happens with respect to enforcing environmental laws. I know how you build cases that involve law enforcement, the interagency coordination that's necessary to build a case, to bring the evidence to bear. We have good laws on the books that need to be enforced. I was in Brentwood on Earth Day talking with members of the community, and we're talking about the fact that there are trucks that idle in the public setting there on their way into the transfer stations to either dump the trash or pick up the solid waste. And we have regulations and law on the books that restrict how long trucks can idle. But the trucks are idling a lot longer than they're legally allowed to do. So we need our agencies to do the work of enforcing existing laws. And then we need to use the law and the power of the law to require companies that are not complying with the law to do so. Ideally, by getting them into compliance, and if not, having to sue them for damages and recompense to get them to comply. We need a lot of coordination with our agencies and good lawyers in the AG's office working with the great people who work at the Department of Energy and Environment, the folks that are working at DCRA on permitting and on following up on making sure the permitting process that's there to protect our environment, that those requirements are being met. When people are building, and you were talking about the forefront of development in our city and the communities that are most significantly impacted, our government needs to work to make sure that those construction companies are in compliance with the building permits and the environmental regulations that they're required to follow when they are doing building in our city.
Appreciate that. Those are great comments. Last question, gentlemen. It's on statehood. Now, statehood continues to be a primary focus of constituents across the city, as you probably have heard. 2 minutes each. How do you see statehood interplay with other legal hot button issues or even political issues of the time, say gun control and abortion rights here in DC? And how do you foresee your office of the Attorney General or not to attain statehood for DC in the short term and the long term? And along with that, what are the advantages and disadvantages, given your experiences in the courts and maybe with the prison system of statehood? It's a lot in one question, but generally, give us your take on statehood, the legal ramifications, the interplay with our courts, and the political hot button issues of the time. And now let's start with Mr. Jones.
Thank you. Statehood is a very hot button topic in and of itself. We see signs all across the city. I grew up in Washington, D.C. with taxation without representation, staying into my memory as far as what we see on license plates everywhere we go. So I look at home as being some sort of gatekeeper to allowing the district to operate as it needs to. We have 700,000 or close to 700,000 residents here that are paying taxes in a high proportion that is due a vote in Congress. However, we need to have elected officials write our laws and enforce their laws so that we are safe. That means with home rule, we have to wait. It's affecting how we get judges, it's slowing down our courts. We have to wait on having a budget approved. We have other issues concerning statehood that without us having authority and autonomy over our books, that put us in harm's way. And I understand all of those arguments. However, I know that we must do everything in our power to fight right now. I don't want to look to excuses for why we can't get things done. I want to look to what we can do because there are people who are looking to us for answers right now. So we have to use everything we can in our power right now to advocate on behalf of the residents and the district government. I look at statehood as basically a hurdle, just a small obstacle in order to get the things we need to get done for the district residents. If we're going to be putting good laws on the books and we have to create them in a rider in our budget, we'll do that. And that means we're talking about gun control, we're talking about women's rights, we're talking about reproductive rights, we're talking about whatever issue we know is pressing on behalf of district residents. We're going to go out there and find creative ways in order to get around this obstacle.
Thank you. Mr. Schwalb, on statehood, the Attorney General's office and statehood. Thank you.
There's no principled good argument for why the residents of the District of Columbia are deprived of the fundamental right to have representation in Congress and the Senate. There's no good argument, in my view, against statehood, except we recognize now it's a political question. The Supreme Court has said that. And in the words of the musical Hamilton, we don't have the votes. We need the votes. We got to do everything we can to try to get ourselves to a place where we can get the votes. One place we do that is by having an extraordinary Office of Attorney General. And we all, as residents of the District of Columbia, owe, I believe, a debt of gratitude to our current AG, Carl Racine, our first independently elected AG, because under his leadership, our Office of Attorney General is recognized as one of the premier state AG offices in the country, on a national stage as a thought leader, taking on some of the most difficult issues of the day and doing it well. That's a great step towards statehood when we show the country, we show the people who are in Congress and the Senate that we can take care of our business and do it well. We have to make the argument for statehood wherever we can, because obviously it has very real consequences. But I also think we need to focus on the reality that until we get the votes, we need to be thinking more about expanding home rule in meaningful ways in which we should have control over certainly the tax dollars that we generate locally, our local dollar budget. We should have control over the way in which judges to our Superior Court and Court of Appeals are appointed. We could have a mayor nominate and have a DC council confirm judges instead of having to wait for the feds to approve them. We should have more control over our criminal justice system, not just juvenile justice, but our entire system, at least our local laws, like DAs across the country. We ought to have the ability of the elected attorney general to make the critical decision about whether a 16 or 17-year-old young person is charged as an adult or as a juvenile. There are these steps along the way where we can expand meaningful home rule on the way to statehood. And as AG, I'm going to be looking for every opportunity to do that till the one day we get that political question and we do have the votes to become a state.
Thank you for that, Mr. Spiva, AG's office and statehood.
This is a moral imperative, and it is also a practical imperative. And it is the issue of DC statehood is one that I have been fighting for decades. It is true that at the moment we don't have the votes, but one must have an appreciation, and you need an AG that has an appreciation of what it has taken to get this far, to get the number of votes that we now have. We're closer than we've ever been. It didn't just happen by magic. It didn't happen by waiting. It was those of us like myself and others who were arrested for statehood, who fought in the courts for more local autonomy, sometimes against the sitting AG. It took testifying in Congress. And that's the type of activity we're going to need to achieve statehood. We need to be carrying this message everywhere we go outside of DC to gather more allies to help us get the votes to achieve statehood. And we need to be rallying the folks here at home, because too many of them have given up the fight because they think that it's impossible. And so we need to rally them to engage in the fight. Again, we must never give anyone the impression that we're satisfied with our colonial status. We were able to achieve greater budget autonomy a number of years ago through the efforts of my efforts and other people's efforts, the great efforts of the DC Appleseed at the time. But unfortunately, we had to fight our own AG to achieve it ultimately. And luckily, our local courts upheld that. And we now do have a greater degree of budget autonomy than we did before. We can do the same with the courts. But ultimately, in order to protect ourselves from the issue of the Congress taking away a woman's right to choose if the Supreme Court decision comes down, as it seems that it will, in order for us to protect our own gun laws, at least to the same extent that other states can protect their gun laws, we must have statehood. It has practical effects for many, many issues, big and small. And you need an AG that appreciates what it takes and is willing, it has the courage to do all that he or she can to press the issue.
Right on. Candidates, we are a little bit past time. We started late, but I want to respect your time. I know how hard that campaigning is and how much time you're putting into this. Really appreciate your time with us tonight. For the folks on Facebook that are following, I know we're getting some questions. I'm encouraging everybody to reach out to the candidates directly and ask your questions. Obviously, from tonight, we can see how open they are to answering your questions. So please reach out to them directly. Candidates, closing statement. I want to first thank you for your time tonight. And please give us your closing statement, 2 minutes each. And if you can, in there, just as practicing attorneys, a case or that you've directly been part of, or that you are that you heard of, or a key case in your own personal lives and the people you've represented, or whatever. How has one of those cases, pushed you to run for AG, and why? And then close it out with your personal close, and if you can say your website so that everybody can reach out to you. Thank you.
Who's going first?
My bad. Let's start with, we'll do alphabetical to end it all off. Mr. Jones.
Thank you so much. I'm Ryan Jones. I'm running for Attorney General for the District of Columbia. I want to be your attorney. I got into this race because of some of my experiences in and out of courtrooms. One such case was one that went to the Court of Appeals, which was a contract dispute for a property owner, which ultimately ended up in a loss for my client. And that invigorated me to ensure that the judges are making the right decisions every time, especially when the laws are on the sides of residents that should be protecting them. I've had these real issues come before the courts and them not get it right. I won't be shy about saying it, and that's been my greatest motivation in order to, in running for this race, some of it anyway. And so those are the types of moments when you realize how impactful the law is and how significant advocacy is on behalf of clients and what you're fighting for. I got into this race in order to use my ability to help more people. I watched what happened in 2020, and I watched disparities grow, and I watched things get exacerbated, and the problems that we're talking about today are a great concern to me, and I know my colleagues as well. I talk about much of what I would like to do, not for me, but for the benefit of everyone. I want to be able to use this opportunity to create a blueprint that cities can use across the country in order to create a more fair, equitable society that uplifts and empowers everyone of their particular area, wherever their residence is, but especially right here in the District of Columbia, my hometown. You've mentioned before opening up how difficult campaigning is, and it weighs on us all. I wish myself the best, my colleagues the best going forward as we're running down to the finish line. And please go out and vote for Ryan Jones as a guy that really wants to fight on behalf of everybody to see a more equitable future for us all. Thank you.
Mr. Jones, how do voters reach you? What's your website?
You can reach me on Twitter, Ryan Jones for AG. You can reach me on Instagram, Ryan Jones ESQ. And you can reach me at the website, RyanJonesforAG.com.
Thank you so much. Mr. Schwalb, a favorite case, your close, and how we reach out to you.
You know, picking a favorite case is a little bit like saying who your favorite child is. And, you never want to offend one child by picking another. I'll never forget the first case I tried. I was in law school, and a young woman, Sandra Andokar, had 2 infant children. She didn't speak any English, and she was being evicted by her landlord in the middle of the winter in Boston. And I went to court and fought against that eviction, kept her and her kids in her home, and even won some money in damages for the deplorable conditions she and her family were living in. And that was a immediate recognition of the power of the law, and the power of the law can have to change people's lives and keep people safe. The single most great privilege I've ever had as a trial lawyer is representing Freddie Woods, convicted of capital murder in Alabama, 19-year-old Black man who was accused and convicted of killing a white store owner in Alabama, a capital offense. His trial was so full of constitutional error, it would turn your head. But hearing about the way he came up, the conditions he lived in, the lack of any real support in a family, and the abuse he underwent as he grew up, allowed us to show to a judge in Alabama why his trial was constitutionally infirm, why the penalty and the guilt phase needed to be turned around. And with a little bit of luck, Freddie Woods is going to be a free man before he turns 50. He's already been up for parole once, and in Alabama, the hope is the second time around, he'll be a free man. No work has ever been equal to that experience. But the sad thing about Freddie's experience and being arrested in 1996 as a Black man in Alabama is that there are too many people in Washington in 2022 experiencing the same kind of unfairness, where the system and the law doesn't work for them. As a lawyer and as Attorney General, the job is to make sure the law works for everybody, that our government works and that people are protected. And that's what I'm going to bring every day as your Attorney General. 30 years of experience practicing law, fighting for people, leading teams of lawyers, recruiting lawyers, being independent, and being a warrior for the people and the city that I love, that has been great for me and my girls to live in, and that I hope for generations will be important and a livable place for all of us.
How do voters reach out to you?
I hope people will get behind me and support me. The easiest way is to go to our website, Brian, BRIAN 4FORDC.com. And thank you, Chris. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you this evening.
Thank you. Mr. Spiva, maybe an important case, not a favorite case, because it is like choosing children, but yeah, an important case, your close, and how we reach out to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brian and Ryan. I have had cases in cramped and small state courthouses fighting for the right of Black and brown folks to vote, and young people, and even argued a case all the way up in the United States Supreme Court last year fighting for voting rights. Even though I did that by phone because of COVID. But really the case, and there've been so many, fighting for housing rights, fighting for consumer protection. But the one that really sticks with me, Chris, is a young woman and her mom and her sister came into my office 1 year late in the year, and they told me a story that outraged me. They had been to other lawyers who turned them down. But I took it on. She had been sexually assaulted and drugged at an off-campus party, and then she was blown off by the hospitals and the police that her friends had taken her to. And it didn't really fit anywhere within any of the types of practice that I had done previously. But I worked very hard. My partner and I worked very hard on it for many years. And sometimes I wondered whether I had done the right thing by taking it on, and whether I would ever be able to get any justice for this young woman. And I was sitting in my office alone shortly after New Year's 1 year, probably 6 years after that first meeting. And every year I sent the family each a holiday card, the mom and the sister and my client. And as I was sitting there alone, maybe feeling a little sorry for myself, I got an email from the mom thanking me for the holiday card. And she said to me something that I have never forgotten. She said, "Sometimes I think that God must have sent you to us for a reason." And it was right then that I realized that I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. And I was doing exactly what I was meant to be doing. And we ultimately were able to achieve justice for that young woman, and others in that case served as a catalyst for the council passing the Sexual Assault Victims Protections Act of 2014, which provides the right of a survivor to have an advocate with them in their dealings with the hospitals and the police, so that hopefully the same thing will not happen to another young lady again. And that's really my philosophy and why I am seeking the office. When we see an injustice, we must never walk away. We have a moral obligation to fight to try to change it. That's the reason I believe that we were put on this earth. And these aspirations to try to use the power of the office for housing justice and criminal justice reform and workers' rights and consumer protection, these are not things that just came along for me during this election season. I've got a lifelong record of fighting for the people and winning. And
Mr. Spiva, how